They didn't have half our brain size, and they still outlasted us. One tribe, one night. They burned another tribe's camp to the ground for a water hole. This wasn't a war against nature. It was a war against each other. In open grassland, a saber-toothed cat doesn't wait. And neither did they. No boats, no maps. And somehow they reached an island nothing could walk to. They crossed deserts that killed everything else around them. A volcano could erase an entire tribe in seconds. And somewhere, another tribe just kept walking. They were still alive when our own species finally showed up. 2 million years. That's not a typo. This is Homo erectus, the species that never stopped walking. You share more with a primitive caveman than you think. And it's not what you'd expect. 2 million years ago, in the dust of East Africa, something stood up and never really sat back down. Not the first hominin to walk on 2 legs, but the first to look, move, and live like an actual human being. Long legs built for distance. A body built to sweat instead of pant. A brain still only about 2/3 the size of yours, and yet this species, Homo erectus, would go on to outlast every single human species that came after it, including, quite possibly, us. This is the story of the humans who walked out of Africa and never stopped. Across deserts, across oceans they shouldn't have been able to cross. Through ice ages, eruptions, predators, and each other, for almost 2 million years. Let's start at the beginning. Around 1.9 million years ago, in what's now Kenya and Ethiopia, the fossil record shows something new. Not just another upright ape, but a body plan almost unsettlingly close to our own. Earlier hominins were still built for the trees. Short legs, long arms, a body made for climbing as much as walking. Homo erectus was different. Long legs. A narrow pelvis built for efficient walking and running. A rib cage shaped like ours, not like an ape's. This was the first hominin built to move across open land. Not just survive at the edge of the forest, but actually live out in it. And they needed to. Because the climate was turning against them. East Africa was drying out, forests shrinking into scattered grassland. The safety of the trees was disappearing. Homo erectus didn't retreat from that change. They adapted their entire body to walk straight into it. Around the same time, their tools changed too. Earlier, hominins used simple, sharp-edged stone flakes. Useful, but crude. Homo erectus introduced something new to the world, the Acheulean hand axe. A symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tool carefully shaped on both sides. It's the first tool in human history that shows real forward planning. can't make one by accident. And then there's fire. The oldest strong evidence for controlled fire use comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, dated to around 1 million years ago. Burned bone and ash deep inside a cave, far from any natural wildfire. Homo erectus, or a very close relative, had brought fire indoors. Warmth, protection from predators, and eventually cooked food, which some researchers argue is exactly what allowed the brain to keep growing at all. In 1984, on the shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya, a fossil hunter named Kamoya Kimeu spotted a small piece of skull eroding out of the ground. What his team eventually uncovered became known as Turkana Boy, a roughly 9-year-old Homo erectus who died 1.6 million years ago and remains to this day the most complete early human skeleton ever found. He stood tall, long-limbed, built almost exactly like a modern human boy his age, just with a smaller skull. For the first time, scientists weren't looking at scattered fragments and guesswork. They were looking at an actual body. Proof that this new way of being human wasn't a theory. It was real, and it was walking around Africa 1.6 million years before any of us existed. But standing tall and walking far didn't make life safe. Homo erectus shared their world with animals that would kill a modern human in seconds. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas capable of cracking bone, crocodiles far larger than anything alive today. With nothing but wooden spears and stone tools, they weren't just occasional prey. They were hunting animals that could just as easily be hunting them. And the threat wasn't only from other species. Some of the clearest signs of violence in the human fossil record come from exactly this period. Skulls with fracture patterns that don't match an animal attack or an accidental fall. Wounds that look uncomfortably like they came from another hominin. Researchers are still cautious about how common this actually was. But the evidence that exists suggests something blunt and simple. Homo erectus wasn't just fighting to survive nature. At times they were fighting each other for it. Water, territory, whatever the land could still offer. They survived the predators. They survived each other. And then they did something no hominin had ever done before. They left. In 1991, at a site called Dmanisi in the country of Georgia, archaeologists found something that didn't fit the accepted timeline at all. Hominin skulls dated to about 1.8 million years old, found not in Africa but in the Caucasus at the edge of Asia. This was, and still is, the oldest confirmed evidence of hominins outside Africa. Homo erectus hadn't just adapted to open grassland. They'd used that adaptation to walk straight out of the continent that made them on foot, with nothing but stone tools and fire, into completely unfamiliar land. And they kept going. In 1891, a Dutch anatomist named Eugène Dubois, digging along the Solo River on the island of Java, uncovered a skull cap and a thigh bone unlike anything catalogued before. He called it Pithecanthropus erectus, upright ape man. Today we know it simply as Java man. One of the first Homo erectus fossils ever identified, and proof that this species hadn't just crossed into Asia. They'd made it almost as far east as it's possible to go, which raises an uncomfortable question. Java, at certain points in history, was reachable by land, but some islands further east, like Flores, never were. Not even during the lowest sea levels of the ice ages. Flores has always been separated by open water, and yet stone tools dated to roughly 1 million years old have been found on Flores. Tools far too old to belong to modern humans. The leading, still debated theory is almost hard to say out loud. Homo erectus, or a population descended from them, may have crossed open ocean. Possibly by accident, swept out on floating debris during a tsunami, and survived long enough to leave tools behind on an island they had no way of planning to reach. No boats, no maps, and quite possibly a version of this species ended up isolated on Flores anyway. A population some researchers believe may have eventually evolved into the small-bodied hominin known as Homo floresiensis. The science here is genuinely unsettled. But the tools are real. And nobody has a better explanation for how they got there. Through all of this, the world itself kept trying to kill them. Over close to 2 million years, Homo erectus lived through repeated ice ages. Entire climate collapses that reshaped coastlines and wiped out other species outright. They lived through volcanic eruptions violent enough to blanket whole regions in ash within minutes. Droughts that could empty a landscape of food for years at a time. Other hominin lines in other regions simply vanished under this kind of pressure. Homo erectus, generation after generation, kept adjusting, kept moving, kept finding the next valley, the next river, the next patch of land that could still support them, which brings us to the strangest part of this entire story. How long it actually took for this species to finally disappear. For decades, most researchers assumed Homo erectus died out somewhere around 400,000 years ago. Then, in 2019, a study published in the journal Nature redated skull fragments from a site called Ngandong on the Solo River in Java. The same river where Java man had been found more than a century earlier. The new dates put those remains at somewhere between 108,000 and 117,000 years old. which means the last confirmed Homo erectus population on Earth may have still been alive at roughly the same time. Modern humans were already spreading across parts of Africa and the Middle East. Whether the two species ever actually crossed paths in Southeast Asia, whether they ever stood on opposite banks of the same river, we simply don't know. The evidence doesn't go that far. But the timing alone is enough to make you stop and recalculate everything you assumed about how ancient this species really was. So here's the number that started this whole video. From the first true Homo erectus in East Africa to the last known population in the swamps of Java, this species existed for somewhere close to 2 million years. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed for roughly 300,000 years so far. Based on fossils found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. Do the math, and Homo erectus outlasted us so far by something like 6 times over. They didn't have our brains. They didn't have language the way we understand it, or art, or agriculture. What they had was something simpler and, in its own way, more impressive. They adapted. Endlessly, stubbornly, generation after generation, for 2 million years across 3 continents and possibly a 4th. Every human species that came after them. Neanderthals, Denisovans, even us, is in some sense still running the experiment Homo erectus started. Walk out into a changing world. Adapt or disappear. They walked for 2 million years before they finally stopped. We're only 300,000 years into our own attempt. If you want to know what happened to the humans who came after them, the Neanderthals, and how close their story came to being ours instead, that video is right here. Subscribe for more real history science is still piecing together, and I'll see you in the next one.